It's no secret in the First Descendant community that Blair kinda sucks. Even Nexon feels that this is the case, as Blair is the only Descendant to receive 2 rounds of buff once for Season 1 drops to try and improve his pick rate. But with the peek into the next patch, it sure seems like Blair could soon be cooking.
Hot on spicy meat. Yeah, boy.
In this video, we'll be taking a look at how the patch could affect Blair's kit, answer the question if this is enough to solve his problems, and I'll also share my top 3 builds to take into Season 1, ready for those buffs to go live. We've got a lot to get through, so what are we waiting for? Let's jump right into the notes from Nexon. So we ended up with a large paragraph for Blair talking about what they plan to fix in the next patch coming Thursday, some of his basic kit, and notably a couple of lesser used Transcendence mods also getting a tasty buff. So let's work our way down the list and talk about how each affects his current gameplay loop, starting with Pitmaster being improved to be a more enhanced based on the number of active flame zones deployed. Now currently Pitmaster gives us a bonus to our skill crit rate depending on the total zones currently active, making duration and cooldown huge for Blair to really benefit from this passive ability. With 1 zone we get 5% additive, 2 this goes to 9%, and lastly 3 or more this comes to 14%. With the way this is worded, we could definitely see Blair turn into the main crit-based skill build out there, hopefully pushing to take that crown from Lepic, or alternatively becoming a very solid crit mobbing character, using damage over time to take out hordes at a time. Now while we don't have much in the way of solid figures for how this will be improved, I do hope this pushes the 3 zones or more closer to 20%, giving Blair the nice skill crit, consistency that he deserves, and that his kit is clearly built around. On top of all this, I keenly want to know how this update will affect 2 main Transcendence mods that affect the skill, and in different ways. Classic Chef, for example, mutates a couple of abilities for Claire, but mostly gives the guy an increase on Pitmaster max stacks, going from 3 to 5, and also affects Deadly Cuisine's fire pit that it leaves. With Pitmaster now going up, our 4 zone count gives 20% crit rate and 5 gives 30%, which is obviously a huge amount of additive crit rate. With the increase to Pitmaster as a whole, hopefully we can see this mod push up in usage, as even a bump up to 40% at max would be huge, and with enough investment would make Blair crit across the board. While some may see this as too strong for one Descendant, please keep in mind that this can't be abused in Colossus fights, as the red mod does reduce the damage of Deadly Cuisine, so Blair is left without a response to those scenarios. Going from a skill mod to a firearm one though, Blair's Backdraft mod changes his kit to work as a less effective version of Valbu's Supply Moisture, providing nice crit rate and damage bumps, but making it much more clunky to manage due to the flame zones needing absorbing, and also out on the field. With a 3 stack of zones out, Pitmaster provides a nice 14% additive crit rate for the boost, and with these changes to Pitmaster coming, fingers crossed this also affects Backdraft, so Firearm Blair can also be a nice build to rock, perfect for budding weapon masters and to help him take down larger foes. Next up for Blair, he gets a duration bump to his skill 1 while getting a double whammy with its MP cost being reduced. This is pretty huge for him and his gameplay loop, as originally you needed to heavily invest in duration and cooldown to have the max amount of buffs up on him. This meant you had to sacrifice on either his kit or his survivability in the early levels for him, as you couldn't get away with having both. Now while his skill 1 isn't amazing at damage, it is great at unlocking the potential for his kit and getting some dot damage going, which guns can benefit from dealing additional damage to burning enemies, or his skills can benefit when paired up with the Archie mod of Decimator, pushing his modifiers higher and higher as you get the kills. Now while this is a simple change, it's definitely going to have a nice impact, meaning we can invest less into duration to the skill to get the fullest of his kit. And now for the big one though. The main reason Blair's kit struggles currently is how it relies on him casting out flame zones, just to absorb them back in, then cast them back out again for that crit rate buff. Now as you can imagine, this is a massively time consuming, putting zones out one by one or with your ultimate, but also a pain for consuming your resources after you've just put them out in the world, all to just get a 14% buff to your crit rate and a bump to your skill power modifiers, which you'll then need to redo every 10 seconds to stay as strong as you can. Now fortunately, Nexon has seen the error of their ways with this part of Blair's kit, as with Season 1, Extinguish will no longer retrieve the zones to gain the Taste of Aggression buff, instead it will count the zones currently active and snapshot that for the buff. This means no longer do we need to have huge cooldown reductions to get our zones out, no longer do we need to worry about placements and leaving them, and nor do we need to worry about what zones will disappear when we use this skill. This also makes this whole gameplay loop much easier to maintain, as we no longer need to worry where we'll get those 6 total flame zones from. Instead, we can work with the 3 that we get from skill 1, and every now and then use his ultimate to get a bigger power spike. Extinguished will feature inside of every single build for Blair now, being just a power bump just for free. The crazy part here is that if all this is changing, Blair can also be an MP conduit, activating a skill for free cast and recovering MP per flame zone each time it's used. But the fun doesn't stop there, as Blair's most consistent and satisfying skill to use, called Burn Taste, is also getting the buff treatment, gaining a damage buff and even a way to cancel the skill so you're not stuck in the animation for the full 4.5 seconds anymore. Now, while this isn't the buff that I had personally hoped for, as I really wanted duration buffs to affect how long we can stay casting the ability instead, a damage buff is always welcome, meaning you'll be melting any enemy that comes your way. The combination of the above and this, I have a feeling that this skill will be deadly for mobbing, and maybe even for taking out stubborn enemies if the damage bump is substantial enough. So that's Blair's kit and the buffs it's seeing, and as if this wasn't enough, Nexon also wanted to look at his lesser used mods, making them much more viable. As a side note, I love that Nexon aren't just sitting back on lesser used mods. Transcendent mods really do change up a playstyle for each character, and I hope that they consider a few others down the line for changing too. Anyways, back to Blair. First up, we get Incendiary Bomb, getting a change, bumping up its max skill stacks for its skill 1. Now, admittedly, while this is a buff, it shouldn't have downgraded his stacks in the first place in my personal opinion, taking it from 3 to 2 when equipped, and all just because he can throw the skill instead of deploying at his feet. Now, I imagine we'll see this go back to 3 max, which is nice to see, but I don't think this will do enough to make this mod viable. The loss of radius and the lower stacks held this back, and I just don't think that the stacks is the issue here. Then lastly, we have Classic Chef gaining a nice bump up when using Deadly Cuisine, enhancing this effect. Now, unfortunately, that's all we've got, so what this means we currently have no idea, but I'd imagine it will either be a damage bump to offset the nerf to the modifiers you get when you're equipping it, or it'll be an increase of the zones that are deployed from 4 to 5, maxing you out on your Pitmaster count from a single cast. Regardless of the buff, Classic Chef gives me the sense it will be worth it in a mobbing build, and I'll definitely be trying this out once that patch drops. So what does this all mean for Blair? Will this be enough to make him playable? Well, personally, I think this will work wonders for his viability. Now, while we won't be the easiest dot character to play, with Freyna having more range, higher poison modifiers, and an ultimate better suited for taking down bosses, and Valby having tankiness down to a T, and a Kit having easier to use crowd control, I get the sense that Blair, with the right investment into crit and skill power modifiers, paired that with the buffs to his Pitmaster passive, and the Extinguish skill, could really go to town and dish out some juicy numbers. Either way, Blair should be a much more fun Descendant to play as with the drop of Season 1, so let's take a look at some mid-game builds that you can rock on patch release day. Similar to Freyna and the Ajax guides on the channel, I've made 3 individual builds so you can take your pick into what you want to lean towards, with one dedicated to damage over time farms, one for using backdraft and using strong guns to take down threats, and lastly, a skill-based one using truly Deadly Cuisine to deal a nasty large hit with his ultimate. So kicking these builds off, we have the damage over time build, focusing on skill duration and cooldowns to max out on flame zones when we need them, both for damage traps for enemies and also for our passives. So when you have a look into the module screen, you can see my current setup. Now, to quickly whiz through what we have here, we've essentially got increased HP so that we have staying power, so we can pretty much stay in the fight. We have Battle of Stamina, which is also going to give us a little bit of extra HP, but mostly we want it for that skill duration, which is that extra 8.8%. On top of that, but kind of pairing nicely with that, we also have MP Accelerant, which is also going to give us an extra 20.5%, as well as giving us a boost to our MP, and because we are using our skills, MP is pretty nice here. And we also have the blue mod of Skill Extension, which is going to give us our skill duration by 36.5% as well. Now, you could use maximized duration in here, but I would advise against it. The reason why is because it's going to affect your skill power modifiers, and unfortunately that is going to come at the cost of your burn. Now, we do have ways to increase our modifiers a little bit later on in the build, but when you kind of need it to help you start off with that ramping effect and to be able to get to your maximum amount of power, you don't want to be hindering, you don't want to be nerfing yourself into the ground first before you do that. So that's the reason why I actively stay away from maximized duration, but that is another option that exists there. On top of that, we have Skill Expansion. This is the only range increasing mod. It would be nice to have some extras, but everything else is a bit too crucial in this build, and that's going to give us an extra 92.3% increase to our skill effect range. In combination, we also have MP conversion. This is going to give us an extra, give us our skill cooldown of 36.5%, which is the most that we can see on one single mod when it comes to this build. Now, we do have other ways that we can reduce the cooldown if we really want to, but I feel like this is more than enough because we've gone so much into duration. The idea is that we have the less downtime of casting our abilities, and we have the more positive upside as to how much of our duration of our buffs will pretty much stay before we then have to cast them again. So this is more than enough cooldown that pretty much exists inside the build. Now lastly, when it comes to like damage kind of side of things, we do also have some extra cooldown coming from Focus on Dimension as well as Focus on Fire. These two in combination are pretty much perfect for Blair because not only are all of his 3 damaging skills Fire as well as Dimension, it also gives us extra skill power, and the Dimension side of things is going to give us power modifiers, which is huge because Blair does have notoriously low modifiers inside of his build, so therefore getting that modifier increase, getting that skill power increase as well as reducing our cooldowns is pretty huge, and that's probably the best in slot for being able to increase both damage as well as reduce cooldowns. Now lastly, the main kind of MVP of this build is going to be Decimator. Decimator is pretty huge when it comes to this, so what happens is defeating an enemy inflicted with debuffs is going to be increasing our skill power modifier by 5% per defeated enemy for 10 seconds, all the way up to 10 stacks. That means we're going to get 50% skill power modifier for every single thing that exists inside of our build, but the main one that's going to be huge for this is going to be Blaze Up. Now if I'm going to show you what I mean by that, so if I just go into the laboratory and I just click on the settings, so I set the Vulgus levels to, let's say 50. Just because we need them to have the debuff on them before we get them killed. Let's just spawn maximum we can inside this kind of arrangement. We'll turn off invincibility. So I'm going to show you what this means. So as standard, as you can see, when it comes to the Descendant module, our Flame Zone is going to be doing 31.6% and our Burn is going to be doing 8.2%, which is kind of pitiful. We definitely want to increase that a little bit further. So what we want to do here is just put down our Flame Zone. This should affect pretty much all of them in this area. So we get all those kills. So we get 9 of our kills and we get 9 stacks. And then if we head on over to our inventory screen, you can see all the green numbers that now pop up. And this means that we're getting a massive boost to our Flame Zone. We're getting a massive boost to our Burn. And that is then going to start snowballing us ready for everything else that we're going to do with the rest of the build. So that's going to be our modules. You can take a screenshot if that's what you prefer. But then we head on over to the rest of the stuff. So we're going to have a look at our reactor and we're going to talk about components. Now components is the easy one because we're going to be rocking a 4-piece into Slayer. This is the best one that you can get for pretty much every single skill-based build that exists in the game. So getting a 4-piece on that is pretty huge, and that's going to give us an extra 26.1% increase to our skill power, which is pretty much the only reason as to why we rock this, but it just increases the amount of damage we'll be dealing, especially with all our damage over time, as well as all of our extra skills that we're going to be throwing out. Now when it comes to Reactor though, this is a little bit different because unfortunately I haven't been able to get a legendary one. I kind of only just recently picked up Blair, and in terms of farming is perfect Reactor. There's no good farms right now, and it's also not for weapons that I'm interested in, so you know, it's just what that. But in terms of that, you're looking for anything that you can fill with the optimization condition. You want to go into Fire and Dimension, so this is going to be a burning phase Reactor. And then lastly, when it comes to the roles, we're going to be looking for, when it comes to this build, we're going to be looking for skill range, and we're also going to either be looking for, and there's 4 options here, but I do think some are slightly better than others. We're either looking for skill crit damage, we're looking for crit rate, or additionally fire or dimension ratios. All of these are great additions to the build, but I do think that in this case crit damage and crit rate are going to be the better ones to seek out for because of how Blair kind of works with his kit. So firing off into our second build, we get to utilise Blair's Transcendence mod, which is Backdraft. This transforms him from a damage over time Descendant into a heavy hitting firearm focused one. Now how this one works is that it transforms his mostly his level 2 or his skill 2 as well as his passive into more firearm focused, and the rest of the abilities pretty much do the exact same stuff, just pretty much chucking out like flame zones and extra, just kind of working into the passives as well as extinguish. So with the passive we get to see an increase to crit hit damage as base, and on top of that we also get to, instead of our skill hit crit hit rate, we get our firearm crit hit rate instead for our flame zones, which is pretty huge. Now once again, remember this is additive, so this does work pretty much with every single weapon. It also kind of does transform Python into a bit more of a crit hit machine, but obviously I don't really recommend that as the main weapon that you should be rocking with Blair. Now, with Extinguish, though, this is a little bit different, so this does actually double its duration from its skill-based counterpart, but on top of that, we also get our MP recovery, and instead, we now get weak point damage per flame zone that we've absorbed. This goes all the way up to 24%, which is pretty nice, and on top of that, we also get a flat increase of 18% to our firearm attack as well. So with enough duration, as you can see with this build, we have gone up to 33.5 seconds, and there are a couple of ways that I would recommend kind of rolling into this build. There's one that's a bit more kind of like DPS glass cannon, which you can see on the screen right now, and then there's one that just kind of like takes this away, which is going to be conditional recharge, and then kind of relies on your HP and your defense so you can stay in the fight a little bit longer. So obviously the more you get confident with taking on private battles and everything like that, you can rock this build, but if you start pushing into more team focused ones, if you start going into like Gluttony, if you start going into Molten Fortress, all those ones that you can't actually do by yourself, then I would recommend taking off conditional recharge. The reason why is because when you use a skill, and we will be using a lot of skills to kind of activate everything to do with the passive, we're going to be consuming a lot of our max HP, which is going to, in this case, 17.5% at fully maxed, and then it just recovers some of our max shield. So, but we're going to be using ourselves to set us up right at the start. This means we're going to be activating Flame Zone 3 times. We're going to be activating our Fireball. That makes it a 4th ability, and then on top of that, we're using Extinguish. So we're using 5 single casts, and as you can see, that is going to be costing ourselves a lot of max HP. Now, the reason why we do this though is because this works really nicely with Walker Tightrope. So when our HP is 50% or lower, which it will be after we've used our conditional recharge, just like we've just said, we're going to be getting a 30% increase to our firearm attack, which is huge. We're also going to pair this up with our component set a little bit later on, so this is also going to increase the amount of firearm attack we have as well. So you can see as to how we're all going to go focusing into glass cannon DPS right now. Of course, we do have a couple of mainstays here. We do have our increased HP, and we have increased our defense as well, because we do plan to try and stay in a fight. We are going to be getting ourselves low HP, so the more we can stay in that fight, the better. Once again, we are increasing our duration, but this time we're going skill duration and an outstanding investment, and the reason why is because we're not relying on our MP as much in this one because it's not skill based, so we can go for HP heal instead. You can go for maximized duration here, but unfortunately I don't have that currently maxed out, but that will give you 40% increase instead of 20%, and because we don't need to worry about the skill power modifiers anymore, it's just a flat but massive increase, so I definitely would recommend putting that in there if you do manage to find the space. Lastly, we do also have Nimble Fingers, and we do also have Time Distribution. This is going to give us a little bit of skill cooldown, but also Time Distribution is going to give us a little bit more HP, so once again, a little bit more staying power. Reactor-wise, it doesn't matter too much. The main thing you do want to worry about is going to be the rolls that you see at the bottom. In this case, skill cooldown and skill duration up are going to be the best in slot, but everything else is not really going to do anything for the rest of the build. You don't need to worry about it being a burning phase reactor or anything like that anymore, so if you do have one that is tingling, or if you have a toxic one, for example, as long as you've got those ratios at the bottom, that's the important thing, so feel free to slot in anything that you need there. Lastly, for our components though, we do want to swap away from our Slayer set, and instead we want to go for an Annihilation set. Now, the reason why you want to do that is because this is going to be the main firearm focused one, and at a 4-piece, this is going to give us our firearm attack proportionally to the ratio of max HP that's lost. So because we're reducing our HP down to Walker Tightrope levels, we're going to see an increase from our set as well, so we're going to start seeing a massive increase when it comes to our damage. Now, there is one other mod that unfortunately I do not have, which is going to be Shot Focus. I've just not been able to get lucky with the combinations just yet, but if you do have that, I would highly recommend that you do swap it into this build. Lastly, this all depends on your weapon, so I'm going to quickly show off the 2 main weapons that I primarily use for this build. We do have Greg's Reverse Fate. As you can see, this is currently set up. We do want to go into firearm attack, crit damage, as well as weak point damage. This is going to be the main kind of way to increase the amount of DPS that you'll be throwing out. And then lastly, we do have our Enduring Legacy, which is also a really nice gun to use here. Unfortunately, this isn't as leveled, but you can kind of see the way that we're going with this. Once again, the exact same stuff: crit hit damage rate, firearm, recoil, rate of fire, all that kind of good stuff. And ideally, you do want to have a bigger magazine as well, so you do have less time reloading. And then lastly, we get the big boy damage. This is the Power of the Sun in the palmy hands. This is going to be the Fireball build. Now, how this one works is that we're using the Transcendent mod of Truly Deadly Cuisine, which massively increases the damage of Giant Fireball, and when this explodes, we just don't get the flame zones anymore. So what this takes it from a 616% damage modifier on your main Fireball, and it transforms it into a 6,934%, which is huge. This is a bigger modifier increase than what Lepic does on his ultimate, and I think it's starts to rival that of what Kyle kind of has inside of his kit with his ultimate, but you do have this massive kind of like one-hit kind of fireball. This is more than enough for mobbing. This is primarily directed towards going into Colossus fights or bosses, so this is what you primarily want to use this kind of build for. Now, the reason what we're kind of focusing on here is because of the amount of damage it's going to be throwing out. We want to kind of lean more into the rest of the passives with Blair, so we do want to increase our crit hit rate, and we want to increase our critical hit damage as much as possible. And, you know, while technically aggressive flavor is quite nice, it does give ourselves a skill power modifier increase, because the modifier is you know, kind of negligible when it comes to the giant fireball. You don't necessarily need to activate extinguish anymore with this one, so you can just get away with just having your 3 flame zones out and then throwing out your ultimate ability, and that should be the most amount of DPS that you'll probably see. Now, unfortunately, this definitely needs more kind of catalyzing. This definitely needs more slots to be able to fully maximize what this build can actually do. But let's currently go over what this mid-game build currently looks like. So we do have the increased HP. Once again, we are going to give ourselves some nice staying power. We do have Spear and Shield, which is going to give us a little bit of defense, but most importantly is going to give ourselves some extra skill power, which is pretty huge. Skill power wise, we do have Fire Specialist as well. That's going to give us one of the better ways to increase the most amount of damage we're going to eke out without starting to affect our cooldowns, because we don't really want to go into maximize power, I think it is, or maximize skill with this one, because adding an extra 50% cooldown onto this would be huge, and it just would make it kind of irrelevant to be able to use this Transcendent mod. And then lastly, we kind of want to go into things like skill cooldown, so MP conversion makes its way in here. Skill insights to be able to increase our critical hit rate is massive, and as well as skill concentration to increase the amount of damage. And once you do get this kind of fully maxed out, you definitely want to start slotting in things like front lines and emergency measures. So those will start taking up these kind of 2 slots here once I do catalyze in a little bit more. But the other one that's huge for this is Dangerous Ambush. You've seen this on previous Lepit builds, you've seen this on other skills, Descendants, once you start going into Colossus fights. But being able to get that 24.9% or even that 49.8% skill extra power when you start like going into Colossus fights and getting them knocked down and staggered and everything like that is huge, because that means that you're going to be doing so much more extra damage with your giant fireball, and this is going to be the most way to be able to increase the amount of damage that he's going to be dealing. Lastly, because this is a skill build, you definitely want to go with your Slayer set once again. That is going to be huge here, especially with that 26.1% skill power being thrown straight back into that ability is pretty huge. And once again, similar to like with the dot build, you definitely want to get yourself a legendary reactor, but this time you want to go into roles similar to what you would ask for when it comes to Lepic. So you want to go for your skill crit damage as well as your skill creased in power for Colossus fights as well. So these are the 3 builds that I plan to rock on Season 1's launch, setting them up to just in time for the amazing buffs that are heading his way, and possibly turning him into a monster descendant. And there we have it. That is all the info on the buffs and 3 builds that you can take away and start making yourself. I absolutely love Blair, and I have done since the first beta where we got to look at him. I do think a lot of Descendants currently have a stronger kit than him, but with the buffs on the way, it could be enough to finally see him in action. If you learned something with this video and you want to see more content just like it in the future, remember to drop a like and subscribe so you can find your way back to the channel. But this is the section I want to hear from you. How are you finding the First Descendant? What are your thoughts on Blair? And do you think that the buffs will be enough? Let me know all that and more down below. Massive thank you for making your way to the end of the video, and as I always say, keep yourself safe, keep yourselves well. I'll see you all on our next video.